to combine an excellent opportunity to combine two of my interests together in one trip. And so the second um, part of this is birding, and it's a great opportunity for me to see and hear Scottish birds for the first time. And I should mention I was a newbie when I started birding over there. I really didn't do much research in advance. Um, so those of you who have been overseas, it might be somewhat of a review, but for me, a lot of these birds were lifers, which was pretty exciting. Now, the next question is, what's a good time to go to Scotland? And if you look at the climate records on the right, um, well, it's not a particularly warm place to begin with, and it has a reputation of being rather cloudy and wet. But it turns out that April and May are the months with the least amount of precipitation, just over 60 millimeters per month, just over 2 inches actually. But you'll see on the lower graph, the lower graph with the yellow bars, May by far is the sunniest month in Scotland. And it just so happens that coincides with a good time for birding, for the start to the breeding season. And so that's when we chose to do the trip. And this is a map I've drawn. The day it started on April 25th, and went for almost 3 weeks. This just shows you where I traveled on this trip. Part one started in Edinburgh, and this is with my daughter, who you'll see in the slideshow. So it's points south of Edinburgh to what they call the Borders region, near the border with England, and that's where my ancestors came from. And then the second part of the trip was going north into the Highlands to take part in a 7 day birding. Let's go there. 7 day birding tour with a company called Heatherlea, based out of Nethy Bridge. But before we start, I found it sometimes a little confusing when we're talking about common names of birds over there. Um, and part of it is in some cases, they have very different common names for the same species that we have here. So I don't know if you ever heard of a goosander. That's just a common merganser. What they call red grouse is our willow ptarmigan. They don't say loon, they say diver. So you have a great northern diver would be our common loon. Slavonian grebe, a rather exotic sounding name. It's really just another name for the horned grebe. And then when we get into seabirds, which you'll see partway through my talk, the guillemots, they they call them guillemots. We call them moors. We don't have them in Alberta, but on our Pacific coast, for example. And then San Martin um, is the name they use for our bank swallow. So just a few differences like that. So and then here we have another list. In this case, the same genus, but different species, but they're closely related. So you can see um, birds that look superficially pretty similar in a lot of cases, um, like the herons, oyster catcher, herring gull, magpie, wren, dipper, and then what they call gold crest is closely related to our golden crowned kinglet. And then my third list here is very different birds with similar common names. And these are birds that belong in completely different families or different groups. And the other part that's confusing is uh, they often will just say redstart, robin, blackbird, goldfinch, tree sparrow. And in Scotland, when they say those, they're referring to completely different birds than what we would call the same name, basically. So that's just a bit of a primer for the terminology that they use over there. And they tend to omit most of these European birds. They often say European. It starts with European or Eurasian. They don't usually say European or Eurasian. They just use the simple name, similar to what we might do here. Another thing that I was quite happy to discover is that they have this Land Reform Act that came out in 2003, where it gives the public the right to access to large areas of private land, um, as long as they respect the landowner and the crops and so on. So there's a lot of places where you can walk and cycle uh, on private land. And so you will not see a sign like this in Scotland. I didn't see any no trespassing signs. Obviously, this is a little extreme, but um, uh, I was amused by this one, but I didn't see any no trespassing signs in Scotland. So now we'll start with part one, which is arrival in Edinburgh. And we arrived on April 25th on a Friday afternoon. It's a very popular place to visit in the spring, especially on weekends. And there's a lot of international tourism. So just the number of buses coming into Edinburgh was amazing. It's hard to get accommodation and it's expensive at that time of year. We stayed at a couple of places. We couldn't find a big enough place for both of us, but we were both on this street, Queen Street, uh, in central Edinburgh. And on the right, you can see these gardens, sort of this forested area across the street called the Queen Street Gardens. Um, my daughter got the fancy place at this guest house, and and then I bunked in at the Travelodge, a little more Spartan. But one thing I liked about it was on the top floor. It had a window that opened facing those gardens I mentioned across the street. So when I woke up at 5 in the morning with jet lag, um, I just turned on my phone, got my Merlin sound app going, and these are the birds I recorded from my bed, and they're all lifers, So this is pretty sort of enough to perk me up and get me out of bed. Uh, One thing I should mention, it was really useful to have the Merlin sound app for learning the birds. There is a, um, um, a bird pack, I guess they call it Britain and Ireland, I think, and I preloaded my phone with that before I left. So this is the first morning in Edinburgh. Might be what sort of more of a stereotypical view of what you might think Edinburgh would be like, kind of gray, lots of gray buildings, old buildings. And there's a guy with his kilt playing the bagpipes. Um, Actually, he's the only guy that we saw playing bagpipes or wearing a kilt on the whole trip, but uh, I think it was mostly for the tourists, I think. My first bird sighting in Edinburgh was the common wood pigeon, which was a lifer for me. And, sort of getting over our jet lag a little bit, we went over to the competitor to Starbucks over there is called Black Sheep Coffee, which was a nice place to start the day. And then we went on to this rather large park area uh, called Prince's Street Gardens. And you can see that the tulips are doing well at that time of year. Uh, Pretty good for birding. There's my daughter there. We're standing beside this historic fountain below Edinburgh Castle. Uh, you can see the amount of forests and greenery there. I could have spent a lot of time, more time than I did birding there. There's really quite a good diversity right in the middle of the city there. There's the picture of the European robin. Again, much smaller than our American robin in a different group. It's actually this bird, the Eurasian blackbird, that's most closely related to our robin, and it behaves in a very similar, hops around on lawns and has a lovely song, not too different from our American robins. And then as you walk around town, you'll see these statues and often birds perched on them with guano deposition on the head of that one over there. This is a lesser blackback gull, which seems to be quite common uh, in the city. And then looking at some of the historic sites, I could spend a lot of time talking about all these historic buildings and churches. This is St. John's Church. And you can see that the congregation does not think that highly of the US president, based on that poster there. But this will be the the only political uh, slide I'll show here in my presentation. So then in the evening, we walked along what they called the Water of Leith walkway. And they don't use the word creek. They use the word, in this case, Water of Leith. It's like Leith Creek. But right in the middle of town there, they had this lovely walkway um, that we walked along. Behind me there with the columns is I think that's an old spring where they used to get their water from. My first taste of some birds, some more aquatic oriented birds like this Eurasian moorhen. And as you go down further, we get to this place called Dean Village, which I guess used to be a community almost outside of the city at the time, but it was a center for milling grain, I think. So I used the water to run the mill, I guess. Uh, I thought this is kind of an interesting one. Got a robin perched on the tree there in front of an old building. So then it was really just a weekend that we spent in, till Sunday. And then we took this 1 hour train ride on ScotRail south into the area where our ancestors came from. It was about a 1 hour trip. It's actually, the train service is unbelievable. There's so many different trains going different places. This is Waverley Station, which is sort of the center of the railway network. The public transit there is really quite impressive. And in addition to that are lots of buses as well. I mentioned that my interest in genealogy, and I'm not going to go very deep with this one, but just to illustrate that that town that's circled, Galashiels, is in the area where I've found that a lot of our ancestors lived over the last many hundreds of years. And so that's the place we chose to go to. It turned out that we needed to rent a car because all these little villages are not serviced by public transit. But because I had never driven on the left before, I thought it would be a bad idea to rent a car from the Edinburgh airport under jet lag. So it turned out I could rent a car from here. And so that's where we started our little road trip. So we went this is Galashiels, sort of a smaller community. An interesting mural there on the left. So started our day the next morning with smoothies in Galashiels, and then headed over to the rental agency and started our road trip. And I've shown the route here. You can see the scale on the lower right, 5 kilometers, which actually be about 3 miles. They're still using miles over there, but you can see it wasn't a really long road trip. But I was a little nervous driving on the left because I've never done it before. You have to manage roundabouts that are sort of very common there. So our first stop was by the River Tweed, as they call it. The river's down below us. And this is Scott's View. And there are these Eldon Hills in the background. The yellow shrubbery you see in the front is gorse, which is really quite common and really adds color to the Scottish landscape. Although it's a member of the pea family, it's very prickly, so you wouldn't want to bushwhack through it, but it actually adds a lot of color. And one of my first birds was a yellow hammer, and this is where my Merlin sound app came in handy to help me with these birds. And this is a pair of these are old world warblers that they have over there. They tend not to be very colorful. They have really nice calls. These two almost look the same, but they have very different calls. And the chiff chaff is named after its call, which is like it just goes chiff chaff, chiff chaff, chiff chaff. So that's kind of where its name comes from. And then moving a little further south, there's a woodland trail uh, that we took to the statue of William Wallace. On the way, on the right, you see this gray squirrel. This is a bit of a reverse of what you expect, but the gray squirrel that they have there is invasive. It comes from North America and is out competing their native uh, red squirrels. And their red squirrels are different from our American red squirrels. So anyway, it's a bit of a problem. One of these reversals where North American species is has become invasive in Europe. And there's the statue of William Wallace. And if you saw the movie Braveheart, you'll know all about him. Uh, I guess he died in 1305, so that's going back a ways. He was fighting the English. Uh, so there's quite a colorful history in this area. That again, one could go into a lot of depth about, but we're going to focus more on the birds. But I will touch on one of the places we went to just to give you an idea of what we were looking at in terms of our family history. This is a, a kirk and a graveyard with where some of our distant ancestors were buried. In this case, my 4 times great grandparents in this little graveyard shown on the right. And actually, to get to the graveyard, you had to walk across private land to get to it, and that was not a problem at all. I won't say too much more about the family history. We did some explorations, but we ended up our first night at this very quirky hotel, the Dryborough Abbey Hotel, that was started, I think, in 1929. Sort of as a retreat for the big thing was fishing, um, and they had walking trails. Uh, Sort of an interesting place this is an example of what it looked like inside. They've got a red deer mounted on the wall there with the rack. There's some kind of a stuffed raptor in the fireplace. I'm not sure if I can identify it. And various oversized wine bottles, sort of strategically placed in different areas. So it was quite an interesting place to experience. It's called the Dryborough Abbey Hotel because it's next door to a much older um, structure called Dryborough Abbey that was founded in 1150, where there were these monks that lived there and practiced in the very early days. As you might see a number of times, there was a lot of warfare between the Scots and the English, and so it was torched a number of times in the 1300s and onward. You can go in and have a tour of that place. We did that while we were there. And here's what the river looks like early morning. Really good for birding in the morning along the River Tweed. And these are some of the birds that I encountered. I mentioned goosander and gray heron and the Eurasian oyster catcher on the right. And just a woodland trail. I got a nice shot of this Eurasian blue tit. It's one of several species. They're related to our chickadees. And you'll see more of them a little later on. So now, continuing on our road trip, we went south to the southern part to a village that you can see at the very bottom here, Bedrell, it's called. It's a tiny little village where my most recent ancestors lived. And this is where my great-great-grandfather was christened in 1823. That's the most recent. And we found the gravestone where him and his wife were buried as well, or where his parents were buried. Along the way, you can see on the right a European goldfinch, a number of other birds hopping around on the church there. It just so happened we picked a lovely place to stay. We stayed here for 3 nights at this glamping unit associated with the Bedrell Old Manse, but it was sort of located in the middle of a hobby farm with horses, and my daughter loved it. It was quite a nice spot to stay. That's what it looks like inside. And we had amazing weather. I think it got up to 23 degrees a couple of days that we were here. And then there was lots of walking trails in the area. More of an agricultural landscape, sort of pastoral, uh, but still enough shrubbery and forest and trees around. So most of the wildlife you'd be seeing would be things like the black sheep-faced sheep and these curious cows that my daughter was interested in. These are some of the birds that I saw here. Eurasian skylark. It's hard to get those guys perched. They're flying around quite a bit. I mentioned the gold crest on the upper right. There were lots of ring-necked pheasants. They're also introduced to Scotland as well as the ones we have here. Look pretty similar. And then lower left is one of the wagtail species. So this is now moving on from our road trip. And you'll note that I say the total distance driven, maybe 80 kilometers. Uh, and I had a couple of close calls, not used to being on the left. I had to tell my daughter, every time I get to an intersection, tell me to say, Dad, stay on the left. So it takes a bit of getting used to. But in any event, we got back on the train back to Edinburgh for one more night. And then my daughter had to go back for work to Vancouver. And so she took the early morning bus to the airport while I went back to the train station and took a ScotRail train north. So that's part two we're on now, which is the trip to the Scottish Highlands that I took. And so there's the Edinburgh train station. The one thing about ScotRail, it seems like they have a sense of humor. I saw this sign you see on the right saying, "Stay out onboard whiskey distillery." And I was kind of scratching my head about that one until I learned later that it was more of a humorous take that they do for the tourists, I guess. So here we are going north um, through the Highlands, arriving in Aviemore. And one thing you will find, especially when you get up into the Highlands, is there's a lot of bilingual signs. The Scots Gaelic, uh, the smaller font below Aviemore on the sign there is the Gaelic name for that town. So a guy, one of the leaders from picked me up and took me to just a short drive over to Nethy Bridge, which is a lovely village. There it is. It's a Scottish flag. We stayed in this hotel. It's called the Mount View Hotel. And it's the headquarters for Heatherlea birdwatching holidays. It turns out the only people that stay there are people that are on these tours. So they pretty much, I guess, own the hotel. And this is what it looks like inside. It started out in the 80s, I think, doing tours just in Scotland, but they've branched out over time. And you'll see from the brochures in the lower right, they have birding tours to South Korea, Botswana, Gambia, and a new one to British Columbia you could do. Um, so there's really they're managing quite a few different types of tours out of here. And it was a very nice place you see the dining hall there. Uh, it's pretty easy to mix and mingle. I was on my own, but there was other people on their own as well. The one thing also, there's no single supplement. They just had single rooms and it was the same price. So that's my room there with a nice view looking out. So here we're going to go through 6 days of birding on this tour, and this is day one. The birding near Nethy Bridge shown. I'm showing it in yellow on the yellow tracks on the in the middle of the slide here. So our first stop was at this forest, Abernethy Forest. It's within Cairngorms National Park, and it's one of the last remaining large tracts of the original Caledonia. They call it the Caledonian Forest, which has a lot of Scots pine, among other things. So we did a little walk here. They use the word loch, of course, for lake, uh, and see greylag geese, which we don't see here. Also a little grebe with a fish on the lower right. And these are some other birds that I managed to get photos of. I mentioned the redstart, which does not look like ours. It's I think, an old world flycatcher, apparently. Common chaffinch, one of the several colorful finches they have. And then the lower two are another two of the tit species. Um, and apparently they were pretty excited to see the crested tit because it's pretty rare. And it was actually it had a nest in that dead tree behind it there. So then we moved on and had our lunch on this old Spey Bridge overlooking the Spey River to see what the birders are like. And not great photography here, but we had an adult and a juvenile white-throated dipper below us. Uh, the juvenile's on the left. That was kind of cool to see. And then a gray wagtail, which I don't know why they call it gray because it's got quite a colorful yellow on the back of on its back and tail there. So then we went north to the real Highlands, I guess you might call it, a little bit higher elevation. This might be your stereotype view of what Scotland might be like. No trees, very desolate. Uh, but this happened to be a good spot for the common gulls to be nesting. So we drove through this nesting colony, and the road, as you saw, the roads are very narrow. They're almost all paved, but they're very narrow and really only have one lane. So if another vehicle's coming the other way, you have to know where there's a wide spot. You might have to back up to let the other vehicle by. So we stopped by this lake called Loch Darb, and um, we saw this a number of times, but there's a heavy focus on bringing back more forest cover into Scotland. I guess originally it would have been, a very high percentage of forest hundreds of years ago, but uh, I think in 1920 they said there's only 5% of the land area was occupied by trees, and they've increased it to something more like 19%, and they have targets to make it go higher. Uh, and I should add that the percent forest cover in Scotland today is almost twice as high as you'd see in either England or Ireland. So this is the one afternoon we had rather miserable, windy, misty weather, um, quite cold, and that's the ruins of a castle behind that osprey that's flying, and it has I think they said it was a pike, but it's a fish carrying a fish. So that was pretty interesting to see that. Uh, because of the poor weather, we actually came back to the same place a few days later on the way up to the coast. So I'm showing those pictures here as well. They give you a better view of the castle. Uh, and so I looked, what's interesting about these birding tours, I mean, the people are really focused on birds. And so we were looking right at this castle and nobody said a word about it, and I guess maybe if you grow up in the UK, castles are kind of a dime a dozen, but uh, so I had to look up what this castle was about. Apparently, it was built in 1280 on an island, and it has quite a colorful history, uh, as you can see here. I think they used as a prison at one point. And there's a lot of these sort of sites as you travel around Scotland. And this is sort of a typical view, the two vans, folks with their tripods out and their spotting scopes, looking at little dots out on the lake there, probably looking for divers or loons. But I was really delighted to get this close up of a red grouse, uh, also known as willow ptarmigan here. And these are some other birds. The group was quite excited to see a white-tailed eagle juvenile. It's related to our bald eagles, apparently. And then they have also a red kite, other hawk species, and then a few of the birds you see down below here. They do have mallards there, just like we have here. Day two now. This time we went more to the southwest, or southeast, I should say, to the Highlands. And we got up really early for about something like 6 a.m. Uh, because that's when the black grouse are lekking. It's a courtship dance. These are males that we were viewing from a distance on the way. And we really lucked out because here, as we drove up the road, we had these guys lekking right beside the van. And we all had to stay in the van, of course, but it was like we had our little blind, or in a blind, watching these guys. So got some amazing photos of these. And then moving down the road, uh, passing a couple of castles. One of them was Braemar Castle. Uh, it goes back to the 1600s, I think, and recently renovated. And this is very close to Balmoral Castle, where the royal family has their sort of summer residence. And I think that's where Queen Elizabeth passed away in 2022. So, but again, none of the tour leaders said anything about castles or anything like that. It was just, I just said, "What's this castle?" And looked it up on my phone. So the destination for this trip was the Highlands, the real higher elevations, and so we went to a ski area, um, the Glenshee ski area, and took a chairlift up to the top of the mountain. And the one of the we were wanting to see, they were really wanting to see ptarmigan. In this case, the something more like a rock ptarmigan, I think. Not and we were looking around, but I think we were a little early in the season for seeing much in the way of birds, because it's a higher elevation. You're really not much green up yet, but really quite a spectacular view from up there. There's one of our tour leaders. So really, the only good shots I got, well, I got a photo of a mountain hare and what they call a common buzzard. And I found that kind of intriguing. Buzzard is the word they use for a buteo, like this is a buteo, like our, uh, it's close, fairly closely related to our red-tailed hawks. And so they refer to them as buzzards. Another example of different terminology. Then coming down to the bottom, things look a whole lot greener down in the valley bottom there, and the birding was better in general along this little valley here. And these are some of the things I saw. This is a red deer on the left, meadow pipit, and this northern lapwing. It's not a great photo here, but very, very peculiar bird with a big crest on the top and multicolored plumage. Never seen anything like it. I mentioned afforestation, and here's another example of it. You always have, when they try to plant trees, they always have to fence it because between the rabbits and the deer and whatever else, the trees just won't make it. I don't know how successful this was, but you see some of these little squares actually has some trees that seem to be doing okay. So So now we're finished day two, and the next day, this is a trip up to the North Sea coast and a seabird colony that we took on a with a boat trip. So our first stop there on the north coast was Spey Bay, which is a wildlife reserve. Lots of stuff out on the bay there. Too far away for me to take much in the way of photos, though. So I tended to focus on the things that are a little closer by. Uh, like this is a mute swan there, which is their native swan, and familiar male house sparrow. They have those here, the Eurasian linnet and the European goldfinch. And then there's quite a few of these pink flowers you'll see in along the coast. They call it sea pink. I think it's a thrift. They have other names for it as well. And we passed through the town of Banff. This is what Banff looks like. And rather different from our Banff. Uh, I think that our Banff in Alberta was named after this older community. But nearby was where we started our a boat trip, our boat tour to a seabird colony. We really lucked out with the weather. You can see the sea is, there's a bit of ripple on it, but it's pretty, you really couldn't ask for better weather. Uh, and it really is quite a challenge taking photos with a telephoto when you're standing on a boat. Even in these calm seas, it's going up and down. uh, it's the photography is a little challenging, but these are some of the birds I got photos of. Common eider, which we have up in our Arctic area, razorbill. And then we took the boat out to this nature reserve called at Troop Head. It's maintained by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which is sort of I don't know, I think it's a non-profit group, and they've got these sites all over the UK. And you can see there's lots of birds on those cliffs over there. And zooming in a little bit, the ones in the middle are the common guillemots. Above them are some kittiwakes, black-legged kittiwakes. There they are in the water, the guillemots. And black-legged kittiwakes, a lot like gulls, but with black legs. That's the way I saw them as. And a few puffins. They had a nesting colony there. And there's little burrows I think they use. Now, one thing, this site is quite well known. It's the only breeding colony of northern gannets on the Scottish mainland. Uh, Unfortunately, the avian flu epidemic a few years ago caused a very high mortality of these birds and also other seabird species. There's indications that populations are recovering, in some cases at least, due to immunity. I think that the ones that are immune apparently have black eyes. I really didn't study that much, but that's a signal that they're immune apparently for the gannets. And a little treat on the way home, the skipper made a habit of throwing fish overboard on the way back to port. And the gannets knew about this and were following the ship, our boat, which made for pretty easy photography. So here we are back at Troop Head. Or no, sorry, back at port at near Banff. And so now we're on day four, and this is our longest day of driving, about 2.5 hours out to the coast from Nethy Bridge. We called it the Wild West Coast. Our trip went through Inverness. That's just a shot from the front. I was glad not to be the driver. The roads are pretty narrow and pretty pretty high speeds considering the narrowness of the roads in general. First stop was at this lovely little loch called Loch Droma. There was some shorebirds way on the far shore there that I think they call them green shanks, like our yellow legs, but again, too far for me to photograph. That's kind of what the landscape, again, color, lots of color from the gorse. Passing by one of the hotels in Dundonald. Here we are out on the coast now, finally, and we've ran across these harbor seals basking in the sun, uh, shown here at Grenard Bay. And I got a few other shots. This is another one of the old world warblers, the sedge warbler. Lovely call, and common sandpiper, and a European stone chat. So this was a beach we went to, a little park called Melon Udriggle. And you can see lots of spotting scopes. I didn't actually have a spotting scope because well, having flown overseas, I had to make do with my P1000 camera. But from the beach, this almost looks like the Mediterranean or something, the white sand, and that's a very distinctive looking mountain across there. And these are a couple of the birds, the common ringed plover, a bit like our semi-palmated plover, sanderlings, and again, more sea pink flowers. Really quite a beautiful place. And then the way back, this is actually a freshwater lake here called Lac Marais, another sort of protected area. The one thing that the sign talks about is that there are all these islands on the lake. You can't really see them well, but they have the native Caledonian pine woods on them, apparently, so there's so much of that land was just totally deforested that, it was often on the islands where some of the forest survived. And here we are. We had a very long day of driving, but one of the participants had the night before gone out and seen a courtship flight of the Eurasian woodcock at sunset. So we decided to go with her and had a nice walk and lovely picture of the sunset. We saw these black objects flying across the sky. So I didn't get a very good view of the Eurasian woodcock's courtship flight, but it was still a nice way to end the day. And so here we are on day 5. Shorter driving. And one thing I tended to do, it got light quite early there, being so far north in early May. I'd be out at 5:36 in the morning, birding before breakfast. And it happened that there was a rook nesting colony right beside the hotel there. And so I got some nice shots. If you're not familiar with rooks, they're a bit like our ravens, but they have no feathers around the beak. You can see that white around between the beak and the eyes, almost like vultures that you see here. And they were nesting, they're feeding their young in that lower right photo. And while we're on the topic of corvids, I don't have too many other corvid shots, so I thought I'd just do a little overview of those. Carrion crow, which is similar to our American crow, common raven, hooded crows, a little less common. They do have magpies there that look a lot like ours. I think they're a different species, but the call is different. And then lots of what they call jackdaws as well. There are Eurasian jays, apparently. We did not see those. So the group was really excited, still wanting to get up high and see if they could find some ptarmigan. So there was in the national park, there's this mountain railway. It's a funicular that goes up the hill, quite popular with tourists. There's a restaurant up at the top. The only thing that was a bit disappointing was that and maybe understandably, if you take the funicular up the hill, you're not allowed outside of that fenced area. The only way you can walk around up there is if you've actually walked all the way from the bottom up, and we didn't have time to do that. So we were doing all our birding from behind the fence and really got pretty much skunked in terms of um, finding any ptarmigan. But the silver lining of that trip was at on the bottom parking lot near there's a stream we got a nice shot of this white-throated dipper. And then from there, we moved northwest into another lovely valley called the Findhorn River Valley. We have a herd here of red deer showing a buck on the right. And there was lots of birds sighted here. There's just a sampling of them. Um, Lower left is a red-legged partridge, which is not native to Scotland, but it is native, I think, to France and more southerly areas of Europe. And lower right, this was a real long shot, not a great photo, but they have wild goats there. Apparently, they're descendants of goats that were introduced like in the Neolithic times, like 5,000 years ago or something. And so they're sort of feral goats, but they're not originally native to Scotland. Another example of this is similar to here, but there's a lot of interest in going with green energy with wind turbines developments. So there's some really pretty ambitious developments proposed, but there's also controversy. Some of the people that live in these areas are not too happy about the potential impacts on the you know on the area and on wildlife and etc. So we have sort of these similar kind of debates over there that we see here. And then as you almost always discover, driving around is a reminder of the ancient history. And this is an old stone cottage. I don't know how old it is, but really quite striking. Just the amount of time that people have lived, and left behind all these things. So this is my last day now. So we're getting not too far from the end of this presentation. We did another trip up to the coast, this time further west to a place called Lossiemouth. And here we are at this place called Burghead, looking out again, a lovely day. Absolutely. I think that's quite uncommon to go this far with clear skies and no wind, even in May. I mean, it was just phenomenal weather. Uh, Here's some of the birds that we saw along the coast here. Mentioned house martin, maybe a little more like our swallow. One of the treats was seeing this group of red knots, and I guess the breeding adults have this rusty color. So there's a whole group of them there. Got this photo. And then Lossiemouth just down the way. There was an estuary with quite a bit of bird life. A lot of them were gulls, but also others, including this dunlin. So again, often, this was a lifer for me, as most of these birds on this trip were. And then the great black-backed gull, similar to the lesser black-backed gull we saw previously, and gray heron, similar to our great blue heron. And this is sort of our last stop, which is a nature reserve around a little lake on the way back, called Loch Spinney. And they had a bird watching hide, you might call it, where you could view the a lot of waterfowl and water birds of various kinds. And they have this island, sort of artificial island for perching, and I don't know, there might be nesting going on there too. Just a sampling. There were a lot of different types of ducks here, but just a sampling of some of the species we saw there. The tufted duck is close to our greater scaup, but it has this tuft at the back that you see. And the black-backed gull looks similar to our Franklin gull. And then on the near the parking area were these feeders, and this was my one and only sighting of a red squirrel, their red squirrel, which is native to Scotland, and is fairly rare. And when you're driving around, you may see signs on the road, caution, red squirrels crossing. And then upper right, European greenfinch. There's quite a few different finch species. They're all pretty colorful, so they kind of make up for the rather drab coloration of their warblers. And then lower right is their version of a tree sparrow, which is the same genus as the European house sparrow. So it's rather different from ours. And here we are. We're back one more night at Nethy Bridge. And that brings us to the end of my trip. I did not have to take the train back. One of the participants was driving back to England, and I caught a ride with her on the way back. So from there, I flew back to Edmonton. So I'll just end with this group photo that they sent out afterwards, just showing the 9 participants. I was the only Canadian. There was a couple from Australia, another couple from Glasgow, and the others were from England. So but it was a very congenial group. Had a lot of fun on that trip. And so at this point, I'll be happy to take any questions. This is the end of my presentation. So thanks for listening and seeing. So
Thanks, Ted. That was awesome. It was a very cool tour that you went on. A lot of nice scenery to see and got quite a few interesting birds I see.